I want to be very brief and welcome all of you to this latest in a series of programs we've had as we move toward the 50th anniversary of the inaugural of metropolitan government, the joining of Nashville and Davidson County into one government. I'm honored that Mayor Carl Dean asked my great friend Senator Thelma Harper and my great friend George Cate to co-chair this celebration. I'm honored that Pat Nolan and Carol Busey and Beth Siegenthaler Courtney have worked so hard as chairs of committees, and it's been a great experience these last several meetings. And many of you have been here before. I hope you come to every one. The next one will be at Lipscomb. We'll move the venue to Lipscomb, and we're going to have a discussion on neighborhoods. I think it'll be an exciting panel and some interesting commentary. It's always my great pleasure, and he needs no introduction, but he leads our city in the right direction with great good judgment, with wisdom, and always with good humor. Let me introduce Carl Dean, my mayor.
Well, thank you, John, and good evening to you all, and thank you for being here. I was really looking forward to tonight, because tonight was the night I thought that Billy would wear the uniform. But,
All right.
I guess not. You know, well over 50 years ago, a year ago, we started to think about Metro's 50th birthday, and the effort to consolidate our governments, the Davidson County government with the Nashville city government. And that was a really bold move 50 years ago. It was innovative. It was a big deal then, and it's a big deal now. I felt like as a city, we need to do something to celebrate this milestone, to show later generations and newcomers in Nashville how we got to where we are, and to actually educate people as to why our government is a little bit different than other governments. I think a lot of people never think about it and don't even know it. And so this has been, in my mind, a really good opportunity for public education. We had the great idea of asking George Cate, Metro's first vice mayor, Senator Thelma Harper, my good friend, and John Siegenthaler to co-chair this effort, and they've done a great job. They kicked off the process on a day when it was about 108 degrees, and they've been giving speeches, they've been going to schools, they've been doing panel discussions, they've been hosting events like this one. Today's discussion will shed a light on the real impact consolidation has had on real important services such as police and fire. Services that are delivered on a daily basis, services that were offered in other parts of the county and other small towns within the county before consolidation took place, and some of them continued. We're now gearing up for the big grand celebration in April, where we'll have a citywide event to commemorate the day consolidation took effect. And months down the road, when this celebration is ended, I think we'll all be very proud of the time we spent reflecting on it and appreciating our past. I believe more every day that consolidation is a huge part of Nashville's success as a city. When I travel to different places or talk to other mayors, there is inevitably a sense of envy about Nashville that this was accomplished here and all that it's meant for our city. So I hope you enjoyed tonight's discussion, and now it's my honor to turn it over to Carol Busey, our Metro historian, who will introduce tonight's panel.
Good evening. You know, these emergency services are something we all take for granted until we have to call, and then we want them at our house immediately. And we don't want to know that the policeman who comes to our car wreck ends up calling the funeral home to get us an ambulance, which some of you will remember those days. So we are here to talk about the improvements that have been made, the past as well as the present, and to take a little time to celebrate and pat ourselves on the back. So we hope all of you will mark on your calendar April the 6th, come to our big birthday birthday party, which is going to be downtown on the square. Music, food, lots of things going on that day. Saturday, a nice time to celebrate what has happened here in Nashville. Our panel here, let me tell you folks, have they got some stories to tell? And I was sitting here trying to add up how much experience these 5 gentlemen have in public service or in journalism, and the number is probably collectively about 150 years. George Cate, our moderator, must have been in elementary school when he became vice mayor of Nashville. He is a Nashville product. He went to East High School, has a degree from Vanderbilt, went off to the Korean War. And after the war, as he starts practicing law, George decided he wanted to get involved in this city. So he joined a group of citizens who were interested in improving our local government. That commission led to the campaign in 1962 to ratify the charter, and George was elected the first vice mayor of metropolitan Nashville, Davidson County. He has been a long-standing public servant ever since. He's been on, I don't know how many boards and commissions, but he had a long stint on the school board. He's made a very positive contribution to education here in Davidson County. And he's just the nicest guy. He loves to talk about Metro, so it doesn't take much to get George talking about Metro. Next to George is Charlie Cardwell, another one of these people who has given a tremendous amount of service to this community and to our government here. He started out as the financial director under Mayor Richard Fulton, served in that position. He has served every mayor along the way since Mayor Fulton, and he presently is our county trustee. He is a public servant in every sense of the word. He loves his employees. He cares about them. He supports a variety of causes out in our community, including the Council on Aging, and the experience that Mr. Cardwell brings to Metro every day of the week is absolutely invaluable. Nobody who works around Charlie Cardwell ever complains. What a servant he is. Now, next to Charlie Cardwell, we have our police chief. Police Chief Steve Anderson is described as the police officer's police officer. He is absolutely a dedicated law enforcement official. Now, he is, I believe, the only person on the panel that was not born in Nashville, but then since the mayor and I weren't either, we're not going to hold that against you. He was born down the road in Trenton, Tennessee. Went into the Air Force for a while. I think you started your law career in White County, Sparta, Tennessee, but he made it to Nashville. He has been educated at Belmont. He has a law degree from the Nashville School of Law. He served in a variety of capacity. He has come up through the ranks of the police department, and he runs a very efficient department over there in the police department. As I understand it, you have really empowered your precinct commanders, and they love being able to work, to perform their jobs in a business-like fashion. Now, next to Police Chief Anderson, we have our fire chief, Billy Lynch. And Billy Lynch, the mayor wanted you to wear your uniform. Billy Lynch has had just about every job in Metro except mayor, I think. You've had more jobs in Metro than anybody can count. He's probably the Renaissance man of this whole panel here. And Billy has run the jail. He was a deputy sheriff under Fate Thomas. He's had a chance to observe a lot of different aspects of metro government. Under Mayor Boner, he was the director of personnel. He was the temporary fire chief under Mayor Purcell. He's what then became the interim director of public works. And this past year, when Chief Halford retired, Billy Lynch became our fire chief again. So we want you to get your hat out at least and wear it to one of these programs sometime when we're having these these panels, to the birthday party perhaps. Maybe that'll be what you'll wear. And finally, we have Jim Squires, a journalist of national renown, several Pulitzer Prizes he has won. He started out as a reporter at the Tennessean, but that really isn't how he really started out. He really started out as a kid who loved to travel with his granddaddy. And his granddaddy happened to have a car with a siren on it, and he got to go out with his grandfather, Dave Anderson, in the squad car, the State Highway Patrol Sergeant, as he made the rounds here in Davidson County. The book that we know him for is The Secret of the Hopewell Box, and I noticed that there were some copies out here for sale. Now, if you have not read this book, you need to get it. It is a page turner, and all the more of a page turner because it took place right here in Nashville. It's like Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil or The Devil in the White City. It's a nonfiction book that reads quite like a novel. Now, today, I thought that I would get on Amazon.com, Jim, and just see what the going rate for this book was. And a paperback version, which, Sarah Lee, how much is the paperback version out here? 25. On Amazon.com, you can buy a paperback version for $393.62. So I hope you're pocketing all that money, Jim. From
Larry Woods has made more money on this book than me or Random House. And
Thank you. So Larry observed it as a child. He has grown up observing metro politics. He has lived in a variety of cities. His journalism career took him, among other places, to Chicago. He had a Nieman Fellowship to Harvard. He has an acute sense of love for this city, and his observations are second to none. And so it is with great pride and honor that I turn the panel over to Vice Mayor Kate, who will proceed with the questions. And we will have time at the end for questions and answers, so by all means, save up your questions. You're going to have a little time. Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Carol. And ladies and gentlemen, I am happy that you're here tonight. As I look around the audience, I see that not only here on the platform are people who've played a major role in the beginning and the early days of Metro and the 50 years of metropolitan government, but that in our audience tonight are other people who could tell the stories of their own experience with equal vigor and with equal relevance to what's been going on. I have said before, and I'd like to repeat tonight, we are celebrating the birthday of the metropolitan government 50 years ago. But had we not had some outstanding leadership, mayors and their administrations, members of the Metro Council, department heads, and full-time employees of the metropolitan government, and those who dared to observe and write about it and criticize it or praise it as they were motivated to do at the time, that being true, we have a chance really to share some stories tonight. There is no protocol in the seating. There is no protocol in the questions that are asked and answered, but we'll kind of toss those out and see what our panel members have to say. Let me point out one thing. We're talking tonight about public safety. I pulled out a copy of the charter as the Charter Commission first wrote, trying to describe where are the responsibilities under the charter. And this language appears: the functions of the metropolitan government to be performed and the governmental services to be rendered throughout the entire general services district, the entire county, shall include, first, general administration, and next, police. Police got a high priority recognition there. Now, in the next, that's the one that stated a service that's rendered countywide, metro-wide, as part of the general services district. The next paragraph begins to talk about the urban services district. And what does it say? The additional functions of the metropolitan government to be performed and the additional governmental services to be rendered within the urban services district, what was at that point the city of Nashville, shall include, first, additional police protection. Maybe the chief can tell us just what that additional police protection is and what it costs. And next, fire protection. So as the charter was first written, fire protection was an urban service, not a general service. Now, that section of the charter does end with this paragraph. Nothing in this section shall be deemed to limit the power of the metropolitan government to exercise other governmental functions in either the urban services district or the general services district, or to provide new and additional governmental services in either the urban services district or the general services district. That's a general statement, and I think it's an accurate statement. What services would be provided under this charter? Now, I've searched in vain from the index and otherwise to see if it made any particular mention of ambulances or ambulance service. We'll get into that, even though it wasn't specifically described in the Metropolitan Charter as in or out, general service or urban service. So what we have here tonight are people who were very much involved. They were either active participants and have continued to be so, or, as in the case of Jim Squires, were close observers who enjoyed what they studied and enjoyed writing about it. So what I want us to do is to emphasize two things. One, what do you recall of what changes were made in the approach to providing these services from the structure of Davidson County and the city of Nashville to the metropolitan government of Nashville and Davidson County? So what changes occurred immediately? And what has happened during these 50 years? What changes have taken place? And what is the level of services? How accurately, competently are those services provided today? So nobody has been more involved in holding office and observing all of these things than Charlie Cardwell. So I'm going to turn to Charlie first and let him make some comments of his own. Charlie, from what you observed at the time, what you would like to tell us about changes that you saw when the charter was adopted and how it's developed since that time.
Thank you, George. I want to thank Carol for being very nice to me. I actually went to work in 1958 under the old city of Nashville. I was around when metropolitan government came in, but I was a young guy that really didn't think a whole lot about what government was doing. I just knew I had a job, and I did my job every day and went home. But as I progressed, and once metropolitan government came in, and the charter named the director of finance as the first director of metropolitan government. So Joe Torrance was being named the first finance director, which was good for me because I was working for Joe Torrance. So I felt fairly secure that I would have a job throughout metropolitan government. And we started in the 60s putting together a team of staff. We put together an internal audit section. We put together a better budget section than we had under the old city or the old county. So the first few years of metropolitan government, it was just getting our feet on the ground and knowing what we needed to do based on what the charter had said. I guess the early 70s was the issue that we heavily got involved was through additional fire protection and through annexation. I think probably the first 7 years there was no annexation in metropolitan government, annexing the areas throughout the county that was part of, at that time, was the urban services. Then we started looking at cost. I think the first area that was annexed, if I remember, was part of North Nashville. Then the second area, in probably 73, was the Donaldson area. A councilman by the name of Claraday, who just recently passed away, requested that his part of Donaldson that he represented be annexed. Well, when you annex, you have services that you have to render. I think if you look at the charter, it says you'll have fire protection, you'll have garbage pickup, you'll have better drainage areas. So then those things were looked at, street lighting. Then we had to look at cost. And every day someone was looking at what is it going to cost to expand the services. We looked at fire protection as the most expensive cost. And back in those days, we had the volunteer fire services, and within the county, we had private fire service, and they charged every person that they serviced a fee. And if I remember, they would go to each home and ask this person if they wanted to participate with the volunteer fire service or with the private fire service, and they had to pay a fee. Well, as that progressed and annexation progressed, then we had to look at something that would cover the fire service out in the GSD once they were annexed until we could put fire protection throughout the county. And so we went into contract with various private companies to do that. And I remember the first appropriation that was asked for, it was $230,000, and we did not know where that money was going to come from because we had not raised taxes for several years, and it just created a problem that every council member, anytime they wanted their area annexed because they were going to get the services, then we would have to say, where are the monies going to come from? And I guess in '75, when Dick Fulton came in office, that's when we started putting together a real program that really made annexation work and give the community the service that they needed.
Okay. Chief Anderson, public safety is a major role, a major function of local government. And public safety depends to more than almost any other aspect of the government upon the efficiency of the police department. How well the police, those who are serving on a daily basis, relate to the public, how they assess their job, and how they perform it. What's it like to come in not having had the responsibility and all of a sudden find that you're the chief of police, have the responsibility for the whole show? Your turn.
Well, you learn real quick that you can't do it all. Very, very quick. I say this from time to time that there's the thing that you read in the books that you need to surround yourself by people that's smarter than you. And I tried that. It didn't work well because I was setting the bar too low. So I've surrounded myself with people that are a lot smarter than me, and that's worked out well. So what I've done is pass that responsibility to the deputy chiefs and to the commanders at each of the 7 precincts. And we try to keep close touch with the community. They have the authority to make the decisions on a day-to-day as they need be. This is a large county. It's 500 plus square miles. Other cities of our population maybe have 100 different jurisdictions within that geographical area. So dividing it into 7 precincts, soon to be 8 precincts starting next year, is the way that we have accomplished what we need to do here in Nashville in terms of providing support, police services, public safety at the neighborhood level.
Okay. You know, when I was a youngster playing softball in the neighborhood, we understood that somebody was assigned to first base or third base, right field, left field. On occasion, you had somebody referred to as a utility man who was supposed to be able to play anything. Billy Lynch fits that role better than anybody I know. Because Mayor, it appears to me that you and your predecessors, whenever a vacancy occurs somewhere, you say, well, until we find somebody better, we'll call on Billy Lynch. Billy, how do you respond to that? Okay, let's talk about fire department. And remember, fire service was an urban service when Metro first started. It was not till later that it became a countywide service. Tell us about
First,
that.
to answer your question, I guess 4 people taught me how to survive it. 2 of them are here. One's my old attorney back there, Frank Grace.
All right.
He saved me a lot of years. One's my former grade school coach sitting in the front row, and he and his partner who taught me a lot, and then my father. And Mayor, someday I do hope to get a uniform, trying to save money in the budget, and I hope to be able to make it. When I think of the fire service, and I was talking to Judge Bill Higgins, and Judge Higgins was on the city council back in 1974 when the ambulance service came in, and he was telling me the history and the story of how it all came about, and then reflect back in my days when I was born and raised right down the street here. You know, I remember back being raised in the urban service district, having the local fire hall, and that's where everybody, all the kids went, all the adults went, and they would share stories. And then as I became an adult, I moved out in the Bellevue area, which was a general service district, and we had the private subscription, the volunteer fire departments. And to sit back and see what's transpired over these years with metropolitan government's amazing. To watch what takes place, though, in today's world, to me, and the mayor sent me over the fire department about 8 or 9 months ago, back over, to watch how this city has changed and how the fire department in its complexion is changing is a very difficult, I guess, culture to reach in. First thing, I have a lot of respect for Chief Anderson, but Judge Higgins told me back in 1974 when Mayor Fulton had the opportunity to bring ambulance service to Nashville, he had 4 options. He had General Services Department, General Hospital, the Fire Department, or Police. And he really wanted to go to the Police Department, but back then, Chief Ackerman, I believe it was, wanted it so bad on the Fire Department, that's where it came. Mayor, I'll give it to him. He has it, I'll give it to him, and we'll walk aside. But going back seriously, when you look at the fire department today, we all think of firefighters and going in and fighting fires and taking care, and that's true. That is the insurance policy that we all as citizens expect through our tax money. But the up and coming and the real demand in Nashville today to cover the 533 square miles, as Chief Anderson alluded to, is to the increase in ambulance service and the demand on ambulances today. You know, us, the baby boomers, are getting older, and I look at my house. My home's about 11 years old. It's built under modern codes. The codes probably, hopefully, unless something goes drastically wrong, I will not have a fire in my home unless I make a mistake. But there's a great likelihood with my age or my wife's age, we may need an ambulance. And we got to change the mindset within the fire department where they become more dual responsive. Because in this tight economy and with tax money being slim each year, you got to better feel in how to utilize your people, materials, and equipment. And that's the hard part in today's fire world, is to explain how this change is taking place and making sure the taxpayers understand. Ever since 1974, Nashville's run about 19 ambulances daily. There were a couple of years ago, I think they were at 16, they went to 19 about 6 or 8 years ago when there was an increase in staffing to add a couple additional. And Mayor, I'm proud to announce in the next 2 months before our budget is submitted, we'll increase 3 more with no additional staff, but by realigning staff and better utilizing. And this is something that I think metro departments, and this is why I respect so many of them. I got 2 of my employees out in the audience, Jenna Smith and Veronica Frazier, of how you surround yourself, like Chief Anderson said, with very good people, and you rely on those people, and really people who love this city and understand the role of the taxpayer and be able to understand our job is to take care of and provide the service.
That's a good point. You know, these three that have just spoken have had major roles to play during the development of these 50 years of the metropolitan government. Nobody has had a more advantageous point of view of looking at this from a point of view of somebody that had to study it, research it, and write about it than Jim Squires. Now, here publicly tonight, I want to admit, I've never owned a copy of the Hopewell box until tonight. I now own one, just acquired. And the ones that I used in the past, Jim, belonged either to the library or to a good friend of mine, and I didn't feel like I had the freedom to underline portions or to make marginal notes. Now that I have one of my own, do I have your permission to make all the marginal notes and eliminations I need?
Absolutely, George. Absolutely.
Jim, tell us what it's been like during your interesting career as an observer and writer here in the metropolitan government and elsewhere since that time.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that book was so expensive, I can't even afford to own my own book. The one I have belonged to Tommy Osborne's secretary, and there's 2 pages written in there about how she hates crooked lawyers. So now that we got paperback, I got a whole bunch of them. My real qualification for being here is that I played parochial sports against Billy Lynch. I covered George Cate as the first presider over the most riotous bunch of councilmen I have ever seen assembled. As a young reporter, I covered council meetings that if they occurred today would make Nashville headlines on CNN every night. I mean, it looked like you see the Russians fighting and the Brits going nuts. Boy, they had nothing compared to what happened in the first year of the 40-member Metro.
But you were kind and didn't write about a lot of those at the time, Jim.
It was a different world in those days. But my real qualification is that even when I was playing parochial sports against Billy Lynch, I was riding around with my grandfather, who was the street muscle, or part of the street muscle, for the machine that made metropolitan government possible as early as it did. It's fascinating to see, first of all, as a young reporter, it was a great experience because this was such a fascinating and progressive experience in government. And government is, I mean, I've been a fan of government since I was a baby because my parents were in it. I grew up in the Boss Crump machine. When I was a young boy, the political decisions all over the state were influenced by a guy in Memphis who had a political machine, and he had there was a faction of it here that involved 3 extraordinary people, without whom you probably would not have not only metropolitan government, you would not have a one man, one vote principle, which resulted in the reapportionment of every element, branch of government in this country. When this started, the Tennessee legislature had not been reapportioned in 55 years. And that's one thing to remember. Second thing to remember is that the reason that the police function is so prominent in this charter is that in those days, the police function was the seat of political power all over the state of Kentucky, every state of Tennessee and Kentucky, at every place. Police was what government was all about. It's the most important service. And on the other end of it, it was also the place where you raised the money and you built the support. And it was a fascinating, I'll just tell you, I was riding with my grandfather once when I was about 8 or 10 years old. This is how it worked. We come up, my grandfather comes upon a truck with an out-of-state license plate and pulls him over. The siren gets him over. He goes up and discovers that this truck is carrying an illegal load of whiskey, untaxed, headed for some bootlegger someplace, probably in a dry county. or to some restaurant or bar in Davidson County where liquor by the drink was illegal. So what does he do? He stops and calls Jake Sheridan, who had no official job at all at the government in those days. So who was Jake Sheridan? Jake Sheridan looked like George Raft. He wore sharkskin suits. He had grown up in the city machine. There was a guy, Hillary House had been mayor of the city, and that's for 29 years. And the best political organizer he had was Jake Sheridan. And Jake Sheridan knew how the city worked, and he knew how you won elections probably better than anyone else. So why is my grandfather calling Jake Sheridan? Because at that time, the power, the political power, was this triumvirate of three people. Basically, the sheriff, Garner Robinson, Jake, who at this point, I think he was running a liquor store or something in those days. He had no job. And a fellow named Elkin Garfinkel, who was probably as brilliant a lawyer as Nashville ever produced, and an extraordinary character. So what does Jake tell my grandfather to do, who is about the number 3 or 4 guy in the county highway patrol? Take half that load and put it in your car, and tell him to go on with his other half. And then take that load that you've got over to the 5th Ward and hand it out. We need a little help over there. The other thing that would happen is that, and this is, I'm going to try to balance this out. Another thing would happen in those days, in the winter, when the police departments change shifts. You know, new guys come in, drive the cars. Cars come in, get fueled, washed, and they go out for the next shift. In those days in the winter, they would also go over to the coal house. And each trunk of a county highway patrol car, there was a box. They filled up with coal. And they would take it out to people who needed heat in the winter, people who couldn't afford coal, paying off. In the summer, the backs of those patrol cars often contained Huddy Pole beer. And this was a relationship between the citizen and the government that you don't experience here. I'm sure that this government, I haven't watched it in the last 20 years closely, but I'm sure it is corruption-free, it is ethically pure and superior. But believe me, it is an acorn that fell a long way from the tree that spawned it. And more than anything else, I think that what happened is a basic change in the relationship between people and the government. And what's more important is the shift in the political power. In those days, basically the police department served 2 functions besides crime control. They won elections. They thwarted election. They would win, or they could keep you from winning. And they collected money. Another thing that happened, routinely all over the city, it didn't matter whether it was a city or the county either in those days, but you had 2 different jurisdictions, 2 different police hierarchies. And when there was a wreck on the highway, what happened? Got an injury. The first policeman on the scene was given the option. It was his job to decide, one, what wrecker comes, and what ambulance comes to take the people to. So Garner Robinson, of course, all of you know. I grew up in that family, with that family. This book is a labor of love for me. I get emotional reading it because I knew Garner Robinson from when I'm knee high, and all of his, and he was the sheriff. He was the guy, but he was basically the face of the power of this machine, the brains of this machine for Elkin Garfinkel and Jake Sheridan. One expert in politics and winning elections, the other expert in law. And Jake was so smart that Elkin tried to get him to become a lawyer, to go to law school, and he wouldn't do it. He loved what he was doing. And the reason I put so much emphasis on these guys, and I'll shut up when we get to a new question, but you probably would not have this, certainly not 50 years of it, if it had not been for these scoundrels in this machine who one of the things they loved more than anything else was voting. I mean, they believed in the vote. They even voted people who weren't alive. But so they could never be against anything that didn't promote voting. And in those days, the rural domination of almost all levels of government, to the detriment of cities and urban residents, it was just totally out of kilter. I think about the time Metro came in, that 1/3 of the voting public, rural mainly, controlled 2/3 of all the elected officials. There were very few minority representatives at any level, and basically the minority vote was a vote that was to be bought and rewarded for performance. So when they tried to do this in '58, the county, the way the first charter was, and I guess both of them, both votes, you had to, if either political entity voted against it, it failed. So the first effort to do this was basically a political struggle between the county machine and the city. And the city was the one that was going to be helped, and naturally was for it, but the county killed it. The county machine killed it. So, and then there was this reversal, dramatic reversal between '58 and '62, and there were a lot of issues involved. We can go into some of them, I'm sure. A lot of this had to do with the racial population. If you had a 533 square mile jurisdiction, minorities would always stay in the minority. If you didn't, the way the thing was going, ultimately the city of Nashville would look more like Atlanta than it looks like Nashville today. So that was a very tough issue for people to deal with. But there was a meeting. One day, one guy might have been responsible for this 50th anniversary, and it was Garner Robinson, the member of the machine. But between '58 and '62, he got elected to the state legislature. And any group that he was in, he would eventually dominate, just from the sheer force of his personality. He was very charismatic, powerful guy. I mean, he was a character. And so when they needed to get the charter out of you couldn't vote if the legislature didn't empower you to vote. And so by this time, Jake had kind of, his power had dissipated, and Crump was long gone. And Garner was still the head of the Robinson-Garfinkel machine, and Elkin wasn't really much into election politics. He didn't do any of this. He just did smart things like write the charter or get the one-man, one-vote case going. But the new movement, which for some reason finally had all the factions pretty much together, they needed to get something out of the legislature which you couldn't get out of if the Davidson County delegation didn't go for it. So there is this incredible meeting, which is described in this book, in which Garner Robinson, who has been the head of this machine, been running things for a long time, is asked by the people proposing the new charter. This is a bunch of new guys, Beverly Briley, the new commission, which you were on, are trying to get this done, but there's a guy that can really help him who had killed it before. His machine had killed it before. And there was a group of 7 people who were pulling the strings and pushing the vote. And we called them, at the Tennessean, a group of 7. But the Banner called them the 7 Sachems of Metro. Remember that? The Banner was against this. The city by this time was against it. This was not, even though it was going to benefit city residents immensely in the long run, it would hurt their power. When no one was quite sure which branch of government, which entity would be on top when this battle was done, eventually what made this one wonderful, really the best, is that they put the strongest part of government, the urban government, in charge. But no one knew how it was going to come out and what the lawsuits were going to change. It's going to be contests and lawsuits. So the 7 guys assemble. I don't know if all 7 of them were there, But they bring in Garner Robinson and sit him down, and there's a new boss emerging, a guy named H.E. Flippin, who was known as Flip, or in some instances called the honeybee. And why is he called the honeybee? Somebody said because he's the big bee around all which the others buzz. And he has Garner Robinson, this proud man who's been elected in public office since 1946, and is now no longer running all the police functions and collecting all the graft and all the stuff that goes with it. But he has got this vote. And Flip looks at Garner and says, you know, we really need this done. And Garner said, well, I'm going to go with you. I'm with you. So Flippin looks back to him and says, you know, Garner, you have a history of changing sides. Can we count on you? And he said, I told you, I'm with you. I'm with you, Flip. And then Flippin says to him, Garner, let's hear it again. He's got to say it again. I mean, a test of his manhood, everything. Now, if Jake Sheridan had been there, he'd have got up and walked out. And Elkin would have had a temper tantrum. But Garner was progressive enough to know you can't be against voting. You got to be for voting. He said, I'm with you. I'll say it again. And he had to swallow it. And then later he told my grandfather, he said, Flip made me eat a little, but I didn't. Now that is a meeting and a decision that resulted in the second charter. Then what carried it was the county. They organized a citizens committee, and Jim Robertson, who was a nephew of Garner with a slightly different spelling of his name, and my mother and her best friend Guynell Sanders, who became the election chief, they organized the county districts, particularly in the areas that had been annexed by Ben West, where everybody was unhappy. Tennessean was leading this charge. They beat Ben West to pieces over a green sticker. Remember the green sticker? There was one way to raise taxes was to make everybody get the car inspected in order to drive on the city streets. And Ben West made the mistake of making that sticker green, the color of money. And man, the Tennessean wore him out on it. And then Jim Robertson, who was really the successor to Jake Sheridan as a political organizer, and maybe better, organized that, and the county approved it by 70-something%. The city only voted 53%, and the turnout was vastly different. So that's how you got here, with a backroom political deal from the old Boss Crump machine. And they had no idea that they were going to do such a great thing. This was all about political power. And what Garner got out of it was they let him be the first trustee. And after
now, Jim, you know, just 2 weeks ago, at another session of this group, but we did it at the Vanderbilt Law School. Vanderbilt Law School invited 2 outstanding professors of law from Virginia and Texas to talk about what is happening around the country in consolidation. One of those panel members said, you know, the figures indicate that where this has been proposed, 80% of the efforts have failed to be passed. So the fact that we did it the second time around is rather remarkable.
Had to do it with a political deal.
Yeah, that's
why
right.
the government doesn't work anymore. We don't make deals.
That's exactly right. And she also pointed out, said, despite the fact that there was a real rush for it for a while, only 15 actual consolidations have taken place in the years since we did it here. So when people come to Nashville, they want to know, how in the world did it happen? And part of that explanation is certainly to be found in the political circumstances that the persons, the leadership,
That's right.
and their attitude at that time. Well, hey, we did it. Now let me ask you a quick opinion. Charlie Cardwell, you were here when all this was happening. Did we do the right thing to adopt metropolitan government?
We did the best thing that ever could happen to this city. I've watched this city since the consolidation, and we've become a city that we never could have happened if we not have consolidated. I was going to ask Jim, after metropolitan government came in, did this not dilute the power of the power brokers?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that is one of the most important things, is we do not have power brokers. We have elected mayors that have loved this city right through today is Carl Dean. And that never would have happened if we had not diluted those power brokers.
You know, certainly in recent times, we see new district organizations, new buildings, new facilities, organizing in the police department. And we're aware of the fact that the police department is living up to its reputation as a major part of local government. Now, Chief, you've been here more recently insofar as having that responsibility as compared to what it would have been if you'd been chief of police of the city of Nashville when it was adopted. But from your point of view, in organizing and leading and in the quality of our officers, training and experience and dedication, how is your appraisal? Has metropolitan government been a benefit to organizing the police department here?
Well, certainly from a law enforcement perspective, it is. And I sit around the table at the Major City Chiefs Association. That's 73 largest cities in the United States and Canada and Great Britain. And I listen to the issues they have, the jurisdictional problems, the turf wars, the overlaps in services, the gaps in services. So I know this is the most efficient way to provide for public safety in an area this large. Certainly, the responsibility for training, the responsibility for gaps in services, for turf wars, and so to speak, that all rests with me. And luckily, I have a very good staff that gets that sorted out in short order. So I think from a law enforcement standpoint, it is the best way to provide services to a metropolitan area without all the conflict that frankly goes on in other areas of our size.
And Billy, fire service was an urban service when Metro first started. So there had to be a change of structure to make it become a countywide service. It meant that fire halls had to be built. It certainly meant that major water mains had to be furnished out into the county areas so that water would be available to fight fires. Now, you've already given us a little bit of a background on the ambulance service. What's your appraisal of the situation insofar as how that part of public safety has progressed under Metro?
Well, I think it's very hard to describe because, you've gone now, we have 39 fire halls throughout the county. Back then, you had like 15, 14. Going back a little, I had my start under the Flippin days.
Yes.
I'm very familiar with Mr. Flippin and what Beverly Briley called work walk, which was a political operation of how counties, council districts were organized, and to watch it evolve to what today is, it's really remarkable because what existed then and how it worked and what's today, it's like the city is fantastic. Yeah, you've seen a great change in the fire protection, and you've seen growth of it, not only in equipment. When Mayor Purcell went into the GSD and gave countywide protection, there had to be a whole different way of thinking in the fire department of how they were going to respond in the GSD to get the necessary equipment that the charter mandates that the USD gets, and they had to start realigning their staff and how they would respond to those particular incidents. It's been a change with the fire code and how that's evolved in today's world. You gotta, back then we used to laugh when I first started with Metro under Briley and human resource personnel. We were looking for individuals who wanted to run into burning buildings when most of our parents told us, get out of them. And today you're looking for a different educational background. You're looking for two different skill sets, one on the fire, one on the medical, and it's very difficult to combine those together. But there's been tremendous growth. For those who haven't seen Metro evolve since what Jim described or the Briley days forward, it's night and day. I had lunch down at the Southern restaurant yesterday, just to look downtown and see what's going on and how it's going on and think what took place back in the 60s or 70s. It's tremendous growth. I credit a lot of that. Every mayor has had their strengths. I think, Bredesen brought a kind of a stopgap, and it changed. And to me, the culture inside metro departments changed, and the way department heads and their staff start thinking changed. But it's been a progression all the way, because each mayor brought to me great strengths that's made this city the great city it is. One thing I do think Nashville's very fortunate, and from Mayor Briley forward, we have had good mayors. They have each done something very progressive, very positive that's let the next one have great opportunities to bring this city to where it is today. And it's remarkable when you ride around this city and see it compared to when I was growing up or when I first started. There's no comparison. But the demand still keeps going on and on. And I think of the police, I think of fire, I think of the medical service, I think of the infrastructure work that's got to be done. And you brought about the water department's coordination with all these departments is critical. My first job during college was with Dixie Pipe and Concrete when Metro first consolidated, and I got to deliver the pipes. And they let me drive. I was a student because the demand by Metro to expand was so great. And to watch it grow, it's phenomenal.
Jim, your other panel members have followed up on your statement about the power brokers. I can well remember as vice mayor hearing some people talk to me and saying, early in the morning we see a lot of people standing just outside Clark Hardware on 4th Avenue
That's right.
owned by Mr. Flippin. And are they all buying hardware? I said, my understanding is that probably most of them are either seeking a job at Metro or they are Metro employees hoping for a promotion. Because I remember
George,
that some of my good friends would ask for my help in a promotion.
I was there one day.
Well, yeah,
Yes, sir,
all right.
I never had to go, Charlie. I circumvented that. I never went to the hardware.
I was just earlier than you were.
I didn't have
Well,
to go. I had another guy.
What do you say, Jim?
Well, I just add something to that. This is very personal discussion to me. My great-grandfather was given his first job, and once he came to, he had lost a leg on a railroad, and he moved to Old Hickory, and his first job was given to him by Boss Robinson, who was Garner's father. Then my grandfather got his first job as a policeman from Garner. Then Garner went to the Nashville Tennessean through Wayne Witt and lobbied for me to get hired. And then for the next few years, you could not get a promotion or get a job without going to the hardware store. So that has changed dramatically. But what I'd like to just end up with is that even though we talk about it's a lot of fun, a lot of corruption, a lot of good old great stories, incredible characters, what's really important about this, from my perspective now, having been editor of the Chicago Tribune for 10 years and watched other cities work, during that first 10 years of Metro, Nashville became a laboratory for progressive urban government. I went to Harvard in 1971 on a Nieman Fellowship to learn urban government. That's what I was going to study when I went to Harvard. Hell, I knew more about urban government when I got there than they did, because I had been covering this city, and suddenly you have a planning commission run by a guy named Ferris Deep, who was incredible. And the timing is important in this too, because if you remember what was going on nationally in those days, the Kennedys ran for office. John Kennedy ran for office talking about urban plight and poverty, and you had this one man, one vote principle. That case came down in '64, which basically empowered people who had no power before. And so you had a national movement to help cities and to help people have a voice. You had it in the legislative side with the court cases, and you had this interest in urban poverty coming out of Washington. Well, what happened then? So we got a lot of federal grants. We've got federal government interest in helping schools and helping highways and planning. And there would be grants. The cities would compete for federal money. Well, Metro had a tremendous advantage because it was one big jurisdiction. If just think about a county and city up there fighting for the money, who gets what and who gets what piece of this federal pie, and how's it going to be used? Well, it's probably going to be duplicated and each entity would be hurt by the fact that they had to compete for the money and then plan within their jurisdiction. This enabled Metro to plan over a huge and it was much easier during Fulton's days, for example, and Briley's days. They were very successful getting federal money and making Nashville a real pioneer in urban government.
Jim, back
Charlie?
in the early 70s, when revenue sharing became a part of government, we received $8 million a year for 7 years. And that carried metropolitan government through the early 70s into Fulton's administration. But you're right, those type of grants really helped move Nashville to where it is today, or a metropolitan government. So the revenue sharing was very important that came from the federal government.
Let me give our audience a chance. If you have a question, Pat, give it to us.
I don't know who's the best person on the panel to answer this, but in terms of going from fire services being only in the urban service district
Yes.
to being a county-wide function, what role did it play to accelerate that? The fact that private fire companies in town, in the outlying areas, and the volunteer companies made a policy change and decision that if you had a fire and you were not a subscriber, they wouldn't come and fight the fire at your house. So if you had a fire and you were a subscriber, they might come out and put water on your neighbor's house because he or she was a subscriber, but you weren't. They'd let your house burn to the ground. Charlie, did that play a role in the administration
It did,
deciding to go
and
forward with countywide?
Here's the way I think it happened from memory, is all of these volunteer fire services and private fire services joined together and they formed one corporation. And as we annexed, the government gave them supplements to operate these fire services. And they were to service the ones that were annexed, plus they still gave a level of service to the people that were still in the GSD. So that went on from about 1972 until about 81. So the public was either served by metropolitan government or by the private fire services. And that took away a lot of the friction between who they were going to service and whose house did they call on when there was a fire or some type of emergency. But that's, from memory, that's the way it was fairly worked out and smoothed out for everyone.
Anybody else have a question? Yes, Ronnie?
I'll ask a question only a term-limited member of the Metro Council can ask. You all have danced around a little bit one of the political accommodations that ensured we passed Metro government, which was 2 different tax rates. We are now 50 years later, and it seems to me the one thing that keeps our charter from being perfect, since we don't differentiate hardly at all in service, is that inequity in our council and in our community, the difference in the tax rates. And I don't know. I mean, everyone's a different place, so this may not be the forum for it, but certainly Charlie Cardwell in particular could address. The question is, what's this community going to do as we go forward about that? And again, you have to be term limited, I think, to even raise that issue. But nevertheless, it is, I think, the single anachronism in our 50th celebration of our charter.
Ronnie Stein, in services as vice mayor and as councilman at large, has seen a lot of what goes on in the legislative part of metropolitan government. Interesting question. Anybody, Charlie, you others want to comment at all on that?
Well, go ahead, Charlie.
Go ahead, Charlie, and then
My
we'll hear
personal
Billy.
feeling is that we should not have 2 districts. We should have a countywide service for everyone, And really, we should not have a urban services and a GSD. And that's my personal thinking on that. And based on discussion for many years, I think the fire department has discussed that many times. Billy, you want to respond?
Well,
How about that, Billy?
I think the services you actually talk about, police, fire, trash, street light. Police and fire you have. For one, coming from Public Works, I do know trash we can do cheaper probably in metro government than we can in the USD than GSD. I think one critical answer has got to come, and that's street lights. Street lights is a critical and large financial cost. Also, I live in the GSD, and where I live, I have underground utilities. And when the contractor or developer built my subdivision, they never dropped the conduit for streetlights. And for one, if I want to pay this additional tax, I'd like to keep non-wooden poles and wires on my street. And I think the streetlight issue is something that, as a councilman, you have to make some critical decisions because, well, it's a major cost. It's a major cost, and somehow, some way, it needs to be thought through. And I'm talking just as a resident of the General Service District. We can do trash cheaper. You already got police and fire, but that streetlight is critical.
Yes. Mayor?
You all have been in metro government for a long time, and I'd like to know the plus and minuses of a 40-member council. It's a big council, and it's a big county, and they always keep coming up. Why do we have so many people? But I'd really like to hear, because you all have a lot of perspective on a big county.
Can I respond to that? I've worked with a lot of council members, and I've worked with 40 council members since 1963. I think 40 council members serve this community like they should. The only problem I have is they should not be termed out. That's my comments.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
For one, I agree with Charlie. I think Joe Kerr wrote a great article a few months back or a few weeks back about a particular situation and the direct response the councilman gave to a concern that they had. I think the term limits is wrong in the council. I think it's not necessary.
What I think it's done, and I'm going to offend some people here today, I think term limits has really diluted the council. Now the department heads have control of whatever happens in this government. Back in the early days when you had the Scobies and the Fentresses and the Wilsons and those type people, when as a department head, when I took something up to them, they knew as much about that or almost as much as I did when I brought it up there. I could not slow them on anything. And with term limits, a council person, it takes them about 4 years to learn their way around. Then they become lame duck. And they don't really care. So that's what's, if anything has impacted metropolitan government since the inception of metropolitan government, is that we have term limits for the council.
Anybody else? Any other questions?
I think from,
Yes, Chief.
from a police department perspective, it works very well. You got 40 members. We have, within the police department, about 1,500 community meetings every year with our precinct commanders and community leaders and so forth. And so we make sure that all the district councilmen that are affected by that neighborhood are there, or invite them to be there. So when a council person calls me about something, I know that they know what goes on in that neighborhood. If we only had 5 or 7, something of that nature, I don't think you would get the neighborhood service as you do. And then I think that with 5 or 7 that I see in other cities, that it becomes more of a power broker type thing as opposed to dividing over 40 members that are more in tune with the constituents they serve.
let me, we're going to have to close out here in just a minute. Let me point out to you, if you want to know about the politics, and one interesting part of it, there's the book that will tell you the story. Now, if you want to know what has happened in the last 50 years, how Metro came about and much of the Metro, you need to keep your ability handy to read some material that Carol Busey has now written. She has prepared a wonderful summary, and it's undergoing the editorial process right now to describe in great detail the metropolitan government, what its structure is, the politics of its passage, and a lot of the personnel involved. So, Carol, we're indebted to that, so we're looking for one more book. It may not be a full book, but it'll be a long chapter.
Oh, Jim's going to write the prequel or the sequel. I'm not sure which.
All right. We in this community are indebted. We are indebted to the people that conceived of the idea of Metro. We are indebted to the 10 members of the Charter Commission that wrote that charter, and the members of the Planning Commission staff and advisors that helped work with them. But we're also deeply indebted to those who have served as mayors, vice mayors, members of the council, and as department heads and the day-to-day workers in the metropolitan government. The quality of life in Nashville and Davidson County, for most of us, is something very much to be treasured. And those of us who can say we had some role in it from the beginning are happy to see how well it has developed and the leadership that we've received. And that certainly comes down to our current mayor. And Mayor Dean, I'd say to you, you have recruited and supported some outstanding personnel to work with you in Metro, and you've provided the leadership that we've come to treasure and expect, and we appreciate that very much. Let's give those leaders a hand, shall we? And then for our capable panel, I appreciate them. Charlie, well done. At Chief, it was great. And Billy, what you said earlier did not indicate that you were resigning. You just offered to ship some job elsewhere. All right.
He turned it down years ago.
And of course, as a political observer, nobody could exceed what has been done in the Hopewell box. So we appreciate very much, Jim Squires, your being with us tonight. Let's give them a hand too, shall we?